The thing about regulations is that mostly people think they're red tape and they're hella annoying. There also is a lot of distrust in a lot of countries towards their government and their policymakers about actually doing the right thing, particularly when it comes to regulations. But what does need to be said is that when the proverbial hits the fan, people are usually clamoring for the fact that things weren't regulated enough. And that is pretty much the story of regulations, I think, in a nutshell. The other thing is, good intentions. Hell is paved with good intentions, often lead to unintended consequences. All of you have heard of Jevons paradox, or as it's otherwise called, the rebound effect. Basically means no matter what we do in terms of energy efficiency improvement, people will find a way of using that money or that energy to consume more. To make it even harder for policymakers, there is now a new concept called pre-bound, which actually states that as opposed to what we were thinking, people who are living very energy inefficiently actually have less of a chance, which is proven in practice, to improve their energy efficiency. So you think there's a lot of potential by insulating houses, but you end up usually finding that there isn't actually much difference in the energy use. Now, I say that in the end it all comes down to good design and a good understanding of the underlying issues. It's one of my favorite design flaws on Earth. It's a giant autobahn going through a runway, and you either have a 4-lane highway or you have the planes going through. I think it's in Mallorca or somewhere in the Spanish islands. Okay. Sorry about that. And information campaigns are really important, one of the main tools that governments and policymakers have. There are, however, often some translation issues, and I'm going to just give one example which amuses me endlessly. And we do have a Danish person here, so you'll probably know about this one. In Denmark, the message that heat pumps are incredibly energy efficient came out really loud and clear, to such an effect that people actually put heat pumps into their summer houses, which are very, it's basically the Danish version of a batch, and then they let them run all winter because it meant the pipes didn't freeze, and because it was so energy efficient, it was going to be a really good way of actually making sure that the pipes didn't freeze. And then they got in Europe, the electricity bills usually come not every month like they do here, but once a year or every 3 months, and so there were some pretty shocked Danes, I think. It's a problem with not being very clear about your information. There's another great example from the United States. It may be just the States where something like that happens, but it was, around the whole concept of nudging and providing normative feedback and telling people how they are doing in contrast to the neighbors. Well, what they found is if you do that, it actually splits between conservatives and liberals or progressives, and that conservatives actually increase their energy use due to the liberal conspiracy of being told to be energy efficient if you tell them that they're doing better than their neighbors. Slight perverse outcome. Now, this will make Mike happy, I think. Great example about, the age-old conflict between Australia and New Zealand. I shouldn't say conflict, I should say, competition. Friendly competition and rivalry. Insulation subsidies. They're a huge success here. As we heard, we've done over a quarter of our housing stock. Politicians from all colours want to be involved and show themselves at, like the various house openings and celebrations. I mean, I don't know, this is the only time I think Jerry Brownie has carried a pack of insulation. Mike probably made him do it. And generally, I think it's regarded as one of the greatest energy efficiency policies and programs that we've had in New Zealand, full stop. Now, across the ditch was a slight problem. Across the ditch is Australia. It's a West Island, okay? This is probably the kindest headline that I could find. This is Peter Garrett, former singer of Midnight Oil. Great rock band, not a great climate change and environment minister, unfortunately. This is more like what happened. A fraud of unparalleled proportions, hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. Cowboys were insulating graveyards, meatworks, parking lots. 100 houses burnt down, 4 people died because there was foil tacked into the electrical wiring, not to mention the download issue. It was $2.5 billion program. At the height, they insulated as many houses in 1 month as New Zealand did overall. And it's going to cost them over $1 billion to fix the problems of the bad insulation put into the houses. Kevin is from Australia, so he'll know about this. So I'm going to be rude, because you know me, it's going to be okay. But this has actually been called, I think by the Sydney Herald, as the greatest policy fuck-up in Australian history. It increased GDP. I actually think there is a story of Mike or somebody actually telling Peter Garrett before they put it in place that they needed to make sure that they did a proper tendering and made sure that they actually didn't get the cowboys involved in the industry. And I think the response was something along the lines of, "She'll be right, mate, we don't need that."
Well, we had our own old solar water in the 1970s.
Yeah?
Killed it for 20 or 30 years because the cowboys.
Oh, there you go. So there's a solar water heating cowboy story in New Zealand that I haven't unearthed yet. Anyway, so the question is, who do you design for? Now, a lot of you will have met Tom. Tom is one of our great New Zealand technology innovators. Tom is an engineer, as are several of you in the room. I'm going to probably offend you right now, but that's okay, because the problem is that engineers design most of the cool widgets on this planet. Engineers design for engineers.
That's true.
They don't design for people like me. I probably would prefer my lamp to light up in green just because I like green. And it would really offend me if it would then turn red and it actually reduce my power consumption just so I'd have the green light.
Or you turn the lamp on.
Exactly.
Use an iPad.
Very, very efficient. Now, the trade-off, of course, is a big thing around, and you know that from MEPSing, and policymakers are really, really haggling with that problem because you want to make it as accurate as possible. And that's, in policy, people are usually economists or engineers. So we're really about, you know, facts and figures and making it really correct. Well, that really doesn't work because there's this great video. When you get this presentation, please watch it. It is about interviewing people in the UK who talk about carbon labelling. They're asked about the carbon labelling, which is not that complex. Like, it seems to people like us in the room, I think it would seem like a pretty straightforward, clear explanation of the carbon footprint. Well, if you look at the way most of the population reacted to it, it made no sense whatsoever. And it ended up actually being $1 billion debacle, and they pulled it in the end, and you know, it caused all sorts of problems. So it's very, very, very important that you understand who you design for, and I'd say you often need to aim for the lowest common denominator. What's even more important is if the people that you design programs or interventions for, they need to be ready for it. So the smoking is always given as one of these great examples where, you know, social marketing campaigns, seatbelt is the other one, really, you know, took effect. But the thing is, from a practice perspective, if you look at it, smoking, it took about 3 decades before the social norm around smoking being bad for your health and passive smoking being a really socially devious thing to do actually came enough into the consciousness. And then, you know, like there was things like you got nicotine patches and you got quit lines and you got lots of information campaigns and you weren't allowed to display the cigarettes everywhere anymore. And then finally the regulation came in where you weren't allowed to smoke inside bars and restaurants and workplaces. By that time, the social norm around smoking had changed enough that there was no riot on the street. If you would have outlawed smoking the way we did in New Zealand a few years ago in the 70s, I promise you, you would have had a change in government. You may have even had a complete different governance system. Same about social marketing campaigns, like the family violence is not okay. There aren't many people in the country that would actually say, no, family violence is awesome. We have way too much of it, but you know, generally we know it's not okay. And then of course, you know, sometimes the government gets it really right. The New Zealanders will know what this is about, ghost ship Sea Brew. I showed it to Tim so he knows what it's about as well. This is a campaign from the New Zealand Transport Agency, and it was about drink driving, particularly in young people, and it really captured that target audience, and it became a meme. It was probably the biggest meme other than Neck Minute in 2011. And I don't know if they've done any evaluation, but I'm pretty sure it probably actually did help also create a little bit of change around the social norm that it's actually okay to ask your mates not to drive when they're drunk. All right. The debacle of 2007-8. This is what happens when you just flag the idea of enforcing policy without having changed the social norm first. It's not just New Zealand that suffered from this, but it has to be said that we are now extremely behind the rest of the world. In Cuba, they outlawed light bulbs, I think, in incandescents in 2005 completely. In the States, they're changing over 4 billion of them right now to energy efficient ones. China, which is the largest light bulb manufacturer, I think, has banned them as well. Australia has. There's a million examples where, it's very clear. Not to mention the fact that from an efficiency and cost perspective, this really is no argument. But in 2008, this was actually used by the media and the opposition to decry a whole suite of 9 years of Labour government policy as nanny state. And I know the anti-smacking bill, as it was so called, was a part of that as well. But in 2008, the light bulbs were really a big thing. Now, as Mike will tell you, and what is really annoying from the perspective of ECA, is that we weren't even talking about banning them. We were talking about MEPSing them, which means to make minimum standards so the absolute worst offenders weren't going to come into the country anymore. So it wasn't that Helen Clark was personally going to go into everyone's home and actually unscrew the incandescent light bulb, but that's how the media actually discussed it at the time.
But see, you should just stop on point, because there is a real link there. So, although we were really concerned, we just said we explained it wrongly. And the low flow shower heads is a classic case. I say I'm offering a low flow shower head. I'm promising water dribbling out of the shower. I'm saying a super efficient shower head that gets you as wet as you want and as clean as you want. That's a different way of doing it. So we have to be very careful when we're trying to get policy is to think about the language we talk about. We talk about low flow shower heads. Well, I know it's low flow, but how's that going to
Sounds terrible. Yeah.
So that's the sort of message. We really need to think very carefully how we sell some of these new things we want to do, because that can kill it at the start.
Absolutely.
But see, there's a context, and the context is the run-up to the national elections. And so there was a certain